The first time my son told me to get out, it was at my own Christmas table. His hand was on the back of my chair, his voice sharp, saying the seat belonged to his wife. A moment later, I was on the floor, staring at the legs of the table I had set myself. What he did not know was that everything about his life began to change that night. My name is Margot Hensley. I am 62. I have lived in this house for more than 3 decades. I bought it when my son was still in elementary school, back when I believed stability could solve most things. The deed has always been in my name, the bills, the insurance, the quiet responsibility of keeping everything standing. None of that ever felt important enough to say out loud. When my son and his wife moved in, it was supposed to be temporary, just until they got back on their feet. That was how he phrased it. Standing in the doorway with boxes stacked behind him, I told him to take the bigger room. I told them to make themselves comfortable. I told myself this was what support looked like. Over time, I stopped thinking of the house as mine. Not because anyone asked me to, but because it was easier. Easier to step aside than to argue. Easier to keep the peace than to explain why I still mattered inside these walls. I paid the bills quietly. I adjusted my routines. I learned when to speak less. By the time Christmas arrived, I had convinced myself that harmony was something you earned by staying out of the way. That belief followed me into the dining room that night, right up to the chair I had always used. And the moment my son decided I no longer belonged there, Christmas dinner had always followed the same rhythm. I cooked. I set the table. I made sure everything was ready before anyone asked. That night was no different, at least on the surface. "I can handle the plates," my daughter-in-law said, reaching past me before I could answer. "That's all right," I replied. "I'm almost done." She didn't look at me. She slid the plates into different positions, shifting them an inch here, 2 inches there, small movements. Quiet ones. I noticed that my usual place at the table had been nudged closer to the corner. My son stood near the counter, scrolling on his phone. "Can you grab the bread?" I asked him. "Yeah. In a minute," he said, eyes still down. The food went out. The chairs filled. Conversations started and stopped without ever quite landing. I waited for my son to look up, to meet my eyes the way he used to when he was younger and wanted reassurance. He didn't. My daughter-in-law sat down first, smoothing her napkin across her lap like she'd already decided where she belonged. My son took the chair beside her, the one he'd never taken before. I paused with the serving dish still in my hands. "Mom," he said, finally glancing up. His voice was flat. "You can put that there," he pointed. Not to the head of the table, but to the remaining chair near the wall. "I've always sat here," I said. I kept my tone even. I didn't want this to turn into something. He shifted in his seat. Things change. No one laughed. No one spoke. My daughter-in-law adjusted her napkin again, a small smile touching her mouth as if the decision had already been made. I set the dish down slowly. The room felt tighter than it had a moment ago. I told myself it was just a chair. I told myself not to read into it. I reached for the place I'd always taken, unaware that this was the moment the evening would finally tip. I reached for the chair the way I always had, not hesitating, not asking permission. My hand touched the back of it, and for a split second, everything felt normal. "Mom?" My son stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. I looked at him. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. He glanced at his wife, then back at me, like he needed to check something before speaking. "That seat belongs to my wife," he said. "Get out." The words landed heavier than I expected. Not loud, not shouted, clear, final. "I'm just sitting down," I said. My voice stayed calm because I didn't know what else to do with it. "She's already sitting," he replied, pointing to the place beside him. "You can take the other chair." I followed his finger. The chair near the wall, slightly pulled back. The one no one ever chose unless there was nowhere else to go. "I've always sat here," I said. His jaw tightened. That was before. Before what? I didn't ask. I didn't move. His hand came down on the back of my chair. Not gently. He yanked it back, sharp and sudden, as if the furniture itself had offended him. My balance went with it. The floor came up fast. My palms hit first, then my hip. The breath left my body in a short, ugly sound I didn't recognize as my own. For a moment, no one spoke. I stayed there, stunned. Looking at shoes and chair legs and the hem of the tablecloth, I waited for someone to say my name. I waited for someone to tell him to stop. My daughter-in-law didn't look at me. She smoothed her napkin again, eyes fixed on the table. My son stood over the chair he'd pulled back, chest rising, as if he'd just made something clear that had needed saying for a long time. I said, "Get out," he repeated. Quieter now. I pushed myself up slowly. My hands were shaking, but I kept them close to my sides. I met his eyes, searching for something familiar, an apology, a crack. There was nothing there. In that silence, something settled inside me. Not anger, not even hurt, just a hard understanding that whatever line had existed between mother and son had been crossed, and he hadn't stumbled over it by accident. No one moved. I stood there waiting, half upright, half braced, as if the room might correct itself if I gave it a second. It didn't. The table stayed set. The food stayed warm. The silence settled in like it belonged. "Margot," my sister-in-law murmured from the far end, then stopped. She looked at my son, then at his wife, and lowered her eyes. My brother cleared his throat. "Let's just eat," he said. Not to me, but to the table. I bent down and picked up the chair myself. My hands shook, but no one reached out to steady it. No one asked if I was all right. My son didn't sit. He stayed standing, arms crossed. "You didn't listen," he said, as if this were a lesson. "I told you already. I heard you." I replied. My voice surprised me. It didn't sound broken. It sounded tired. His wife finally looked up. "We don't want drama," she said, softly, like a reasonable request. I nodded once. "Neither do I." My son exhaled through his nose. "Then sit where I said." That was it. No apology. No second thought. Just instructions. My mother reached for her water glass and took a sip, eyes fixed on the condensation. "It's Christmas," she said quietly. "Let's not ruin it." I realized then that no one was shocked. No one was confused. They were uncomfortable, yes, but not because I'd been pushed. They were uncomfortable because it had happened out loud. I slid the chair back into place. Not at the table, but beside it. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of every person who had chosen stillness over decency. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of decisions already made, and none of them were in my favor. I raised my son alone. That part of the story always sounds heavier than it felt at the time, because I didn't think of it as sacrifice. It was just what needed doing. When he was 10 and forgot his lunch, I drove it to school without telling him to remember next time. When he broke a neighbor's window, I paid for it and told him accidents happen. When teachers called about missed assignments, I explained he'd been tired. When landlords complained about late rent years later, I transferred the money and told myself it was temporary. "You don't have to." My sister once said when I covered another bill for him, "I want to," I replied. "He's under pressure." I said that a lot. "He's under pressure. He's finding his way. He needs time." What I didn't say was that I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped smoothing things over. Afraid that asking for accountability would feel like rejection. Afraid that boundaries would sound like abandonment. "Mom, you worry too much," he used to say when I asked questions. "I just want to help." I'd answer, "I've got it handled." He'd insist, and I'd step back. Every time, When he moved back into my house as an adult, it felt natural to keep doing what I'd always done. I adjusted my schedule. I paid the utilities without mentioning it. I cleaned around their messes instead of pointing them out. "It's just until we're stable," he said the first month. "I know." I told him, "Take your time." Time passed. Months folded into years. I never asked what stable meant. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. I solved problems before they became his. I absorbed discomfort so he wouldn't have to. I confused love with endurance and called it patience. Standing in that dining room, with his words still ringing in my ears, I understood something I hadn't let myself admit before. He hadn't taken power from me in one night. I had handed it over, quietly, piece by piece. Every time I chose peace over honesty, and once it was his, he used it exactly the way he'd been taught. I reached for my coat without asking permission. The movement felt deliberate, like I was finally choosing something instead of reacting to it. "Mom," my son said, not standing, not moving. "You're overreacting." "I'm leaving," I replied. My voice was steady enough to surprise me. His wife looked up. "We're trying to have a nice holiday," she said. "You don't have to make this difficult." "I'm not," I said. "I'm making it clear." No one argued. No one apologized. The room waited, as if this were another inconvenience I would smooth over if given time. I slipped my arms into my coat and buttoned it slowly, giving them every chance to stop me. My son watched from his chair. "You'll come back," he said, like it was a habit he trusted. I picked up my keys. "Not tonight." He shrugged. "Fine. Do whatever you want." That was it. No concern. No pause. Just permission to disappear. I walked to the door and turned the handle. The house didn't resist. It opened the same way it always had. Quietly. I stepped outside and closed it behind me, careful not to let it slam. In the car, I sat with my hands on the wheel, breathing until the shaking eased. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't begged for respect. I hadn't asked for anything at all. As I drove away, something shifted inside me. Not anger, not relief. A small, firm resolve that felt like the first honest thing I'd done for myself in years. I spread the papers across the kitchen table after midnight, lining them up the way I used to when balance mattered more than speed. The deed sat at the center. My name, alone. I traced it once with my finger, not because I needed reminding, but because I'd spent years pretending it didn't matter. The utility statements followed. Heat, water, insurance, all addressed to me, all paid by me. I remembered the winter the furnace failed, and I wrote the check without telling anyone. "I'll handle it," I'd said when my son asked what was wrong. He nodded and went back to his phone. There was no lease. There never had been. No rent, either. Not once. When I'd mentioned money, he waved it off. "We're family," he said. "I know," I told him. "Just get settled." A folder held bank transfers from different years, groceries, repairs, a car payment I covered when his paycheck ran late. I could hear his voice in my head, "Just this once." And mine, answering every time, "Of course." I opened an old insurance renewal and laughed under my breath. I'd added his name as an occupant years ago, not an owner. "It's simpler," the agent had said. I'd agreed, because simple felt kind. I wasn't angry as I read. I felt focused. Each document carried a memory, and each memory carried a decision I'd made to step aside. Not because he asked, because I offered. My phone buzzed. "His name." I said it face down. I drafted the notice slowly, choosing plain words. No accusations, no explanations. An end date, a boundary. I signed it the same way I'd signed everything else. Steady and clear. By the time I stacked the papers, The confusion I'd carried for years was gone. In its place was something cleaner. I hadn't protected him from hardship. I'd protected him from responsibility. And tonight, for the first time, I stopped doing that. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my coat still on, the keys beside my hand, the house quiet in a way it hadn't been for years. I opened my laptop and wrote the notice the same way I wrote everything else in my life, plain and careful. This is to inform you that your stay ends. I typed. No anger. No history. Just dates and facts. I read it twice, then once more out loud, listening for anything that sounded like hesitation. There wasn't any. My phone lit up again. Mom, answer. My son said when I finally picked up. His voice was sharp, already irritated. I'm busy, I replied. With what fixing what I should have fixed a long time ago, he laughed. Short and dismissive. You're doing this because you're upset. No, I said. I'm doing this because I'm clear. He started to argue, but I ended the call before he could finish. My hands didn't shake when I changed the garage code. I'd done it before for convenience. Tonight, it felt different. I disabled the guest access on the door app and reset the passwords to the utility accounts. Each step took less than a minute. The gas company's automated voice thanked me for confirming my identity. The electric account showed my name. Same as always. I removed his email from the notifications. Quietly. Completely. Another call came in. I let it ring. I printed the notice and slid it into an envelope. I wrote his name on the front in the handwriting he'd learned to recognize as final. I set it on the hall table where he wouldn't miss it in the morning. I stood there for a moment, listening to the house settle. It didn't feel like revenge, it felt like alignment. Like my actions had finally caught up to what I knew. Before midnight, everything was done. I turned off the lights and went upstairs, not wondering how he would react, not rehearsing explanations. For the first time in years, I didn't feel responsible for how another adult would handle the truth waiting for him downstairs. The first call came before sunrise. I was already awake, standing at the counter with a mug I hadn't touched. The phone buzzed once, then stopped. A few seconds later, it buzzed again. I watched the screen light up with his name and let it go dark. By the time the coffee finished dripping, there were 7 missed calls. He left a voicemail. I didn't play it. The garage camera sent a notification next. Motion detected. I opened the feed just long enough to see him standing there in yesterday's clothes, tapping the keypad harder each time it rejected him. He tried the door, then the garage again. My phone rang. Mom. What did you do? He said when I finally answered. His voice was loud, already fraying. I made a change. I replied. You locked me out. I ended your stay. I said. You saw the notice. That's not how this works. He snapped. You can't just decide that overnight. I didn't decide it overnight. I said. I just stopped postponing it. I ended the call. The next one came from his wife. Her name flashed on the screen like an accusation. This is unbelievable, she said. We have plans. You can't pull this right now. You should talk to your husband, I said. He said this is your fault. It's his responsibility. I replied and hung up. The calls stacked up after that, angry ones, pleading ones, long pauses between rings that meant they were talking to each other, deciding who would try next. I didn't answer any of them. By mid-morning, my phone showed 46 missed calls. I pictured the scene without needing to see it. His wife pacing, his voice dropping, then rising again. The realization settling in that I wasn't stepping in this time, that there was no extra room, no extension, no quiet rescue waiting behind the frustration. He texted once more. You're ruining everything. I set the phone face down. For years, silence had worked in his favor. My silence had smoothed over mistakes, softened consequences, carried him through moments he didn't want to face. Today, silence did something else entirely. It held the line. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The house stayed quiet, unchanged, as if it had been waiting for this morning to arrive. He didn't come back that day. He called once in the afternoon. I answered. "You really did this," he said. His voice wasn't angry now. It was smaller. "I set a boundary." I replied, "You chose this over me. I chose myself." I said, "You're still my son. You just don't get my house." There was a pause. I waited. He didn't fill it. "I don't know where we're supposed to go," he said. "That's something you and your wife will decide," I answered. "The same way you decided I didn't belong at your table." He exhaled, sharp. "You're being cold." "I'm being clear," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." We ended the call without an apology on either side. It felt honest. Later, I walked through the house and put things back the way I liked them. Not aggressively, not to erase anyone, just enough to feel present again. I sat down at the dining table and ate quietly. No bracing. No waiting for someone to correct me. What I evicted wasn't my son. It was the idea that love requires surrender. It was the habit of shrinking so other people could feel tall. It was the belief that peace comes from staying silent. Here's the life lesson I took from it. One I wish I'd learned sooner. Boundaries don't end relationships. They reveal which ones are real. Love that survives honesty is stronger than love built on endurance. If you're watching this and parts of it feel familiar, stay with me. Tap like, leave a comment, or subscribe if you've ever had to choose yourself after years of choosing everyone else. Stories like this don't end when the door closes. They begin when someone finally decides to stand where they belong.